We really appreciate the opportunity to share the fruits of the last 15 years of our work in gospel eco-justice with you. We will talk today about discipleship as the work of healing wounds of our place and people in order to more deeply realize God's vision of beloved community where we are. So we are beaming in from the little town of Oakview. That is halfway up the Ventura River watershed, of course, in Southern California bioregion. This is the heart of traditional and unceded Chumash territory, a legacy to which we as settlers here are responsible. This afternoon's talk tries to unpack both of those definitions of place as beloved community. We are drawing from our most recent publications, which build one on another. Ched took the lead on the Watershed Discipleship Anthology, which was a collaborative mentoring project with younger colleagues published in 2016, with an abbreviated Spanish edition published in 2018. And Healing Haunted Histories, a settler discipleship of decolonization, came out just 3 months ago. A 10-year project which I took the lead on, and we'll talk from each book for about 25 minutes with about a 15-minute break after each for question and answer. And we also encourage you to chat your questions and comments in as we go. Jake has volunteered to keep track of those for our conversation.
We want to begin with a brief Bible study to ground our reflections. This is the 33rd year since the publication of my detailed commentary on Mark's Gospel. Its title was drawn from a verse which is part of today's Revised Common Lectionary Gospel reading. You would have heard it in church, except you had a re-homecoming and had other texts, but this was today's Gospel reading. In this verse, Jesus describes his mission as liberating the plundered resources stored in a house ruled over by a dominating baron. It is a militant and perhaps troubling image, one which suggests just how subversive Jesus' teaching and practice was, something we tend to forget in our comfortable churches. So in the spirit of this gospel text, let's briefly look at two aspects of how Jesus inaugurated his mission. In Mark's gospel, we first meet Jesus as he shows up at a remote place on the River Jordan to apprentice with the renewal movement being animated by the wilderness prophet John the Baptist. We're told that Jesus is baptized into the river, suggesting a ritual immersion into the sacred waters of his homeland. Now about that Jordan River, it's the very spine of the land of Israel, running some 156 miles north to south. Its name in Hebrew means descender, as it plummets almost 12,000 feet from Mount Hermon in southern Lebanon into the Sea of Galilee, and then out down the Rift Valley, eventually into the Dead Sea, the lowest body of water on earth. The river also holds some of Israel's most sacred stories. It is where Jacob wrestled with the angels in Genesis 32, an etiological tale about the origins of the name Israel. It's where Joshua crossed into Canaan on dry land, and where they gathered up 12 stones from the river bottom and built a sacred cairn to declare the inauguration of Israel's tribal confederacy in Joshua 3 and 4. It's where the prophet Elijah was taken into the heavens in a fiery chariot. And the Jordan is where the prophet Elisha healed an enemy general, pitting the power of Jordan's sacred waters over that of Naaman's imperial might in 2 Kings 5. We might say then that this baptism inspirited Jesus both from above, with the liberator hovering over him, and from below through a deep immersion into his beloved watershed. This initiation into the sacred wild spaces of a land that was groaning under Roman imperialism prepared Jesus for his campaign to heal his people and his place. In a note of political realism, Mark tells us immediately that after the Baptists' arrest by Herod Antipas, Jesus takes up his mentor's proclamation of repentance, which for them meant to turn our personal and political history around from the disastrous direction in which they are headed, a message surely resonant with our own age. Then Jesus begins building his movement, not among the rich and educated, but among native peasant fishermen at the Sea of Galilee. We know that at this very historical moment in first century Palestine, Rome was aggressively colonizing the region. What this meant for the local fishing industry around the sea was what today we would call a structural adjustment, changing a locally sustainable economy to instead now benefit the urban elite, Romans who had settled in Palestine following military conquest, or wealthy Judeans connected with the Herodian family. And at the center of this colonization was the new imperial city of Tiberias, named after the emperor and built by Antipas, right on the Sea of Galilee. The economic changes taking place during the decade of John and Jesus' ministries were marginalizing and impoverishing formerly self-sufficient native fishing families, like that of the Zebedee boys. Having fallen to the bottom of the economic hierarchy, it stands to reason that these workers would have been responsive to Jesus' vision of a social alternative he called the kingdom of God. So we would suggest that at the very outset of his ministry, Jesus embodies a template for what we call a watershed discipleship of decolonization. Let's take a closer look at this template for today.
Watershed discipleship is a framing concept we've developed over the last decade. It is a triple entendre meant as shorthand to articulate a contextual and constructive approach to Christian eco-theology and practice. The first meaning is a recognition that we are in a watershed historical moment of crisis, which demands that ecological and social justice and sustainability be integral to everything we do as Christians and as citizen inhabitants of our places. The problem is that too many churchly initiatives around creation care exhibit too much sentimentality toward environmental issues. It is our young people who are sounding the more urgent alarm regarding climate crisis because our house is on fire, as movements such as Extinction Rebellion put it. And they are not overstating the matter. The inconvenient truth is that we are facing an ecosystem catastrophe, which will not be avoided by mere cosmetic reforms. Pictured here is the infamous hockey stick curve. We assume you are familiar with this terrible icon of our times. Shown across 24 different indices, such as human population levels, CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, exploitation of fisheries, destruction of tropical forests, water use, species extinction, and of course, global temperature. These realities are taking us, as environmental leader Gus Speth put it in 2008, to the edge of the world. Our profound first world addiction to a carbon economy and to a disastrous re-engineering of the planet represents an end game for our civilization unless we turn around our way of life. Which as Chad just noted, was precisely the core message of both John and Jesus. This most dramatic hockey stick curve of all represents the bottom line. We are headed toward 5 degrees Celsius increase within our grandchildren's lifetime, which will likely render 75% of the planet uninhabitable. 2 years ago, we joined a demonstration in Ventura where the children of our community participated in a die-in to protest these trends. And it has haunted us here. There is something terrible about young people having to do this to get our attention.
So we suggest that part of shedding our denial and awakening to the work before us is to recognize how deep the problems are that we must face, to reach down to the roots of these interlocking crises. And one of these roots is our disconnection from the very ground on which we live. Which brings us to the second meaning of watershed discipleship. As our friend Sam Wells reminds us, our faith is an incarnational tradition, which means that we must take creation seriously, especially when it is groaning in travail, as the Apostle Paul put it in Romans 8. More specifically, we feel that we have to overcome our alienation crisis by recovering this basic incarnational truth, namely, our discipleship and the life of the local church takes place fundamentally in a bioregional context. The key to staving off paralysis and despair, as Arthur Ashe famously put it, is to start where one is, use the skills and resources one has, and doing what one can. In other words, embracing the most appropriate scale of engagement. But where are we? We usually answer this question in terms of a city or a state or a country, that is, according to political definitions and built environments. But in order to put creation at the center of our consciousness as Christians, we must relearn the art of thinking in terms of a bioregion. As the great Wendell Berry argued 30 years ago, the question is not how to care for the planet, but how to care for each of the planet's millions of neighborhoods, each its own small piece and parcel of land, which is in some way precious and different from all the others. Kirkpatrick Sale's 1985 primer defined a bioregion in this way. Bio is from the Greek word for forms of life, and region from the Latin regere, territory to be ruled. They convey together a life territory, a place defined by its life forms, its topography, and its biota, rather than by human dictates. In other words, governed by nature, not legislature. And if the concept initially strikes us as strange, that may only be a measure of how distant we have become from the wisdom it conveys. And what most defines the geography of a bioregion?
This is a view of a barren desert landscape near Hanksville, Utah. Even in one of the most arid climates on the continent, what is the one most distinctive and defining feature to the naked eye? Right. It is the way the water flows. We might say this is the chief design feature of a creation that has not been re-engineered by humans. In contrast, here is an aerial view of nearby Las Vegas, though this could be a picture of LA. Typical of all modern urban sprawls. What's evident here is not where the water flows, but where the automobile traffic flows. It's all artifice. John Wesley Powell was an interesting dude. He was the first non-native person to raft down the Colorado River in the 1860s. But it was his definition of a watershed that endures. A watershed is that area of land a bounded hydrologic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common water course, and where, as humans settled, simple logic demanded that they become part of the community. Let's sit with that for a moment. What does it mean to become part of that community, rather than to re-engineer it for our selfish short-term gain? The fact is, wherever each of us resides, city, suburb, or rural areas, our lives are deeply intertwined within such a bounded hydrological system. Precipitation hits the ridges and either flows into our watershed or into a neighboring one, drained by a watercourse and its tributaries. The area covered in the water's journey from its origination in the hydrological cycle to its endpoint in a particular body of water, such as a pond, lake, or ocean, is the watershed. And it's made up of a unique mix of habitats that influence each other, including forests and wetlands and fields and meadows, rivers and lakes, farms and towns. Which brings us to the third meaning. We need also to be disciples of our watersheds. Senegalese environmentalist Baba Dioum put it this way back in 1968 in a speech to the United Nations. We won't save places we don't love. But Dioum went on to explain that it is not possible to love places that we don't actually know. Yet, ignorance and alienation are socialized conditions, Dioum asserted. We don't know our places because we haven't learned them.
So let's talk about Greater Los Angeles, a global metropolis that is built on top of an actual ecology, specifically on an alluvial floodplain emanating from the San Gabriel, Verdugo, and Santa Monica mountains. And here's the question. How many of you can name the watershed in which you dwell? Do you know which way the water flows, where it originates, and where it goes? Somewhere near you, there's a local creek, river, or stream, though it may be buried under concrete. Because the truth is, all life is watershed placed, without exception. And our ignorance about this fact is consequential. Here's a map of the boundaries of Los Angeles and Ventura counties, where we all live respectively, overlaid onto the boundaries of the major watersheds in our area. You can see the disconnect. Political boundaries are often straight. No continental US state is without one, while watershed boundaries never are. The problem is that straight lines are the first order of abstraction, alienating us from the topographical and hydrological realities that actually sustain us. You see, maps shape our imagination. In Western culture, our social and ecological worldviews have been profoundly shaped by two-dimensional political maps, from schoolhouse walls to GPS. But these maps are social reproductions that in fact enshrine problematic historical legacies of colonization and exploitation, while rendering nature secondary or even invisible altogether. Here's a reimagined watershed map of the US. Just sit with the differences for a minute. How might political culture change if our basic unit of governance was nature rather than legislature? So let's talk about Westwood Presbyterian Church. You are in the Bayona watershed, and you got to be there today, a subset of the Santa Monica Bay watershed. This watershed is bounded by the Santa Monica Mountains on the north, the Harbor Freeway on the east, and the Baldwin Hills on the south, about 130 square miles. Its major tributaries include Centinela Creek, Sepulveda Canyon Channel, Benedict Canyon Channel, and numerous storm drains. You'll notice most of those are built environments. The land use of this watershed consists of 64% residential, 8% commercial, 4% industrial, and 17% open space. The watershed encompasses all or parts of the cities of Beverly Hills, Culver City, Inglewood, LA, Santa Monica, West Hollywood, and unincorporated Los Angeles County. What would it mean for Westwood Pres to focus on your own watershed as the most practical scale of engagement, joining other local groups such as the Bayonet Creek Renaissance to start turning your history around?
Brock Dolmen argues that watersheds underlie all human endeavors and form the foundation for all future aspirations and survival. He is founder of Occidental Art and Ecology Center in Marin County. Cupping his hands, he invokes the metaphor of a cradle, which he calls a basin of relations, in which every living organism is interconnected and dependent on the health of the whole. This is a form of social, local, intentional community with other life forms and inanimate processes like the fire cycle and the hydrological cycle. This is our geographic scale of applied sustainability, which must be regenerative because we are desperately in need of making up for lost time. Our watershed, Dolmen contends, is our lifeboat. So how can our local churches better learn in order to know, in order to save and be saved by the watersheds in which we dwell? Here is an opportunity. Since Bayonet Creek drains into the Pacific Ocean, as does our Ventura River and all West Coast watersheds, June, as World Oceans Month, is a great time to engage the health of your watershed. We hope you are familiar with Creation Justice Ministries, a national faith-rooted advocacy and education organization. We commend their resources, including this month, their June 22nd webinar honoring God's beautiful marine creation, and their new resource, Save Our Sacred Seas. So to summarize the first part of our presentation, we believe that in this watershed moment of interlocking ecological crisis, the church must replace itself, recovering a sense of our watershed as our parish, in which the struggle to restore our watershed as a beloved and just community becomes the locus of our Christian spirituality, our discipleship, and our mission and public witness. The second half of our presentation today will drill down on the second of the talking points listed here. But first, let's take a few minutes for questions of clarification about what we've shared so far. There's Ann.
Ann Chelsea?
Okay, that would be me. Well, if any of you guys know the marina, which I live in Marina Del Rey, and I'm on the waters out there as much as I can be. And for all these years, I never thought about it, but the entrance channel to Marina Del Rey lies behind a bulwark of rocks, which protect the marina itself from the power of incoming waves and water. Just to the south of this entrance channel is Bayonet Creek, as it feeds into Santa Monica Bay and the Pacific Ocean. As I sail by there from this day forward, I'm going to think of it very differently. Thank you so much for pointing this out.
And this is your month. It's World Oceans Month, so.
I guess so. I better get my cap on.
We know that this is a rather major paradigm shift, and some of it might be new. So we're happy to particularly answer any questions of clarification that you have if there's some things that weren't clear.
If you want to raise, if you raise your hand, oh, I see Martha or David, were you trying to clap or raise your hand? Raise your hand, okay. There you go, Martha, go ahead.
You're muted. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We just drove from Los Angeles to northern Minnesota this week. So we drove through all of those bioregions, and it was one of the things that we were just talking about all the time that we were driving. There's a real wonderful portion through Colorado where we drive along the Colorado River through Colorado. That is really phenomenal as well. And if I can, I don't know, will this show? Can you see? We're on a lake right now in northern Minnesota. That is about 20 miles from where the Mississippi River begins. So the whole issue of, oh, by the way, it's 90 some plus degrees here, which should not
relevant to them, Martha.
No, but kind of, well, if you're talking about climate things generally, it's totally not supposed to happen.
Right.
But it is so remarkable when you drive across the country and you see all of these bioclimes as you go and how diverse they are. And also here we're very conscious of what gets put into the Mississippi River because it goes through our lake and we see the consequences. This has just been a really, really interesting and wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, as we speak, there are more than 2,000 people gathering in northern Minnesota on Indigenous land to protest the proposed Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. Right. And so I'm going to just type in the URL.
Sorry, we're trying to, is this the one you want? Okay.
In case you're interested in looking at that, that's probably pretty near to where you are.
Thank you. We'll look into that because we are surrounded by the Leech Lake Indian Reservation.
Yeah, we have many friends on the Leech Lake. So that's great.
And this is the gathering is on White Earth Reservation.
It's on White Earth, okay. And it's happening this weekend.
Yeah, and hundreds of people are expected. So it's a very exciting that's happening there.
Could become the next Standing Rock. So keep it in mind and prayer. And we'll talk more about those issues in the second half. Any other questions, thoughts? If not, we can soldier on.
We can soldier on. And then, of course, if
we'll have another time.
We'll have another time. And if some of it, I mean, these are very interconnected. So if some of it from the first one, please don't hesitate. And also, please, if you're having thoughts, put them in the chat.
Exactly. I was just going to say that, Elaine. Thank you. Yeah, do submit your questions in the chat as they're going along. If something sort of piques your interest or you want to talk more about it later on at the Q&A time, put it in the chat while they're going along. Thank you so much, everyone.
All right. We cool to continue? All right.
Okay, so in the second half of our conversation, let's go deeper into what it means to explore our rootedness in place. Here is what Gaviota Creek used to look like 100 years ago. I believe they are duck hunting. And here is an aerial view of it now. Today, Gaviota Creek is a 9-mile-long concreted flood protection channel that drains the Los Angeles basin. basin. You get the point. This is not exactly what we would call ecological progress. But it's not only the land and waters of our bioregion that have been compromised almost beyond recognition by our inhabitation over the last century. There is a peopled history in our watershed too, and it holds deep wounds as well. Jim Bear Jacobs, a Mohican colleague in Minneapolis, speaks about learning the stories the land holds. Westerners tend to steward their narratives through texts, Jim Bear says, while Indigenous cultures understand their sacred stories to be embedded in the land itself. From this perspective, beneath the surface soil or built environments of every place lies strata of history and culture, much of which was traumatic, especially for First Peoples.
So let me share a personal story. This is a picture of the Gaviota Coast, northwest of Santa Barbara. Perhaps many of you have driven through it on Highway 101. It's where my family used to go to camp when I was a teenager. This was and is the heart of Chumash country, the First Peoples of this place. We often camped in Tahiguas Canyon, the former site I learned later of the Chumash village of Tahiwa. One year, my dad called our attention to an old coast live oak not far from our campsite. It was adorned with this arbor glyph dating to the early 1800s and thought to be a Chumash rendering of a neophyte, that is, someone forcibly taken into the Spanish mission system, kneeling before a Franciscan padre. This was my first exposure as an already alienated teenager growing up in an unchurched home to the heavy footprint of the Spanish colonization of California. But at the time, we just called it the Indian tree, with no further context or conversation. It was only much later that I awakened to the true history of my home place, with its layers of Spanish and then Mexican and then American colonization. Meanwhile, this fading photo hung on my walls, haunting my consciousness.
This quote here is attributed to Chief South, a revered leader of Duwamish and Squamish tribes in Puget Sound in Pacific Northwest. Allegedly spoken to the governor of the Washington Territory in the mid-1850s near present-day Seattle. When your children's children shall think themselves alone in the field, the store, the shop, upon the highway, or in the silence of the woods, they will not be alone. At night, when the streets of your cities and villages shall be silent and you think them deserted, they will throng with the returning hosts that once filled and still love this beautiful land. The white man will never be alone. Not only do these lines speak of the land as haunted, this renowned testimony has also haunted settler consciousness ever since. They were actually written, however, by Seattle settler Henry A. Smith in an 1887 local newspaper article, supposedly from his notes on the speech 3 decades earlier. Historians now believe the words mostly were not South's, but rather the interpolation or even a partial invention of Smith. But if that is the case, they are just as revelatory. You see, in the very same year, that very same year, Smith took thousands of acres of land on which he had squatted on back in the 1850s and sold them to the newly arrived railroad, even though he didn't have the deed. And he became very wealthy, but still haunted. In fact, discourse about a noble but disappearing Indian was a common trope among Western settlers to rationalize their expropriation of Indigenous land and resources. The idea is as archetypally depicted by Tompkins Matheson's romantically racist painting, shown here. Both Smith's text and Madison's art reveal a haunted settler consciousness. The foreboding sense that triumphal ideologies of manifest destiny would never be able to fully erase the Indigenous story and presence, which will continue to ghost white settlers. Recently, sociologist Avery Gordon has been studying haunting as a social phenomenon. In her important book, Ghostly Matters, she asserts that haunting is a constituent element of modern social life through which repressed or unresolved social violence makes itself known in everyday life, especially when they are supposedly over and done with, slavery, for instance, or when their oppressive nature is continuously denied. Gordon also emphasizes how reckoning with these ghosts can mobilize individual, social, or political movement and change, but only if they are faced.
An example is to consider how the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis a year ago animated protests all over the world. And in fact, as Janet was telling us before the presentation tonight, also stimulated this very series that we're in right now at Westwood Pres. You see, this murder, far from unique, unfortunately, in our country, and yet it conjured up ghosts of the long-standing history of violence toward Black bodies in our white body politic. The same could be said of the inner city uprisings of August 1965, or again in April of 1992, in which Los Angeles burned for 3 days each time in reaction to the beating of a Black man by white cops after a routine traffic stop. In both cases, ghosts rose up from the haunted history of racism in our country because these issues weren't being talked about. As Martin Luther King Jr. said back in 1965 when he visited Los Angeles after the first riot, a riot is the language of the unheard.
Anthropologist Thomas Sortis notes that a central element of haunting is secrecy, where the secret may be shameful. This is partly why the Black Lives Matter movement today talks about the need, on one hand, for us white folk to break our silence regarding the killing of Black folk under color of authority. And while on the other hand, insisting that communities of color refuse to be silenced regarding past and present racist violence. The mantra, say their name, is shorthand for finding one's voice to resist the erasure of victims. But it is hard for those of us with race and class privilege to break our silence because of our shame about the injustice and inequality of racism. And because we have long been socialized to presume our settler innocence, we expressed in two ways. One of them is what Canadian scholars call colonial agnosia. This is not, they argue, simply a matter of collective amnesia or omission. Rather, this act of ignoring is aggressively reproduced, effectively invested, meaning it inhabits our emotions and spirituality, and effectively distributed through our educational systems and media. in ways that justify the status quo and render our entanglements in colonization just too difficult to understand. In other words, we don't know about past and continuing injustices, and we don't want to know. Another strategy of silence is to dissociate from these issues, past and present. We imagine that each of us are free-floating entities, untethered and unaccountable to a past which is not our fault. Two other Canadian theorists call this transcendent denial, a foreclosure of knowledge in which the settler must believe that history is in the past and that any and all harm, trauma, and associated accountability has no contemporary actuality. As a result, they assert we are literally sick at heart and soul, making it difficult to look at each other or ourselves without weariness, which extends to all those we encounter as other. James Baldwin wrote in his famous The Fire Next Time that white people are still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. To reckon with this history is not to drown in shame, paralysis, or denial, Baldwin insisted, but to use it for liberation. An invented past, he warned, cannot help us. It will crumble under the pressure of reality. Our fairy tale historical narratives will not protect or heal us. Contemporary Indigenous activist Nikki Sanchez puts it more succinctly. This history is not your fault, but it is absolutely your responsibility.
Because so many of us are so highly mobile, we tend not to learn the histories of the places to which we migrate and reside, however temporarily. So an essential part of watershed discipleship is to combat historical amnesia by learning and engaging the social history of the watershed in which we dwell. In our new book, we call this work Doing an Archaeology of Self and Society, examining the historical strata that lie beneath our places as they continue to shape us. So the deepest historical and cultural stratum to which we need to attend in a place like Los Angeles, it concerns that of its indigenous peoples. Relative to the rest of North America, Europeans were very late colonizing California, having only settled here permanently in the late 18th century, when the US was already a nation. Indigenous tribes, however, flourished here for millennia and are still present among us. Yes, even here in Los Angeles. Prior to European conquest, California had the largest native population in all of North America, consisting of small and linguistically diverse clans and tribes who lived along the coast and in the mountains, in the chaparral and desert lands. The floodplain that became Los Angeles first hosted many villages of the Tongva people, whose place names still mark our landscape, such as Tohunga and Topanga in the west, or Hahamongna, Pasadena, and Asusangna, Azusa, in the east. Native people lived here in bioregionally appropriate and sustainable lifeways without centralized hierarchies, standing armies, agriculture, or urban concentration for some 15,000 years. Our technological civilization, forged in defiance of ecological and economic limits, will be hard-pressed to last another 100.
Beneath the surface soil, or built environment of every place are strata of history and culture. In LA's deep history, for example, 3 broad strata correlate to the history of colonization after 1769, when, by the way, most Europeans thought California was an island. There was a century of violence and displacement by European colonists, first Spanish and then Mexican. And since 1848, the colonial consolidation, industrial development, and forced assimilation of peoples under US rule. These strata look more like this image of the famous San Andreas Fault, which shows tortured bends and twists due to tectonic forces. This is a poignant metaphor for the traumatic labyrinths that colonized people have had to navigate to survive. This challenging stratigraphy has shaped our place of ministry. This is why, if we hope to work for deep justice and gospel good news in our place, we must do this archaeology of history and culture. Native Californian scholar Elias Castillo has helped us demythologize the mission era in California. In the past year, the romantic legacy of recently canonized Father Junipero Serra has been challenged by Indigenous descendants, calling for the whole story to be told. Here in Ventura, his statue in front of City Hall was removed after protests last summer, in which, full disclosure, we were involved in. It's a hard story of genocide and displacement, about which most of us settlers know very little. For example, did you know that the first Indigenous revolt in California was planned by a Tongva holy woman called Toiperina in the late 18th century?
But as bad as things were under Spanish and Mexican colonization, the advent of American rule intensified the disaster for Indigenous Californians, as recently outlined by UCLA historian Benjamin Madley. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, a flood of in-migration by white Easterners began to Southern California. Have you ever seen this famous image that so unabashedly proclaims progress as manifest destiny, John Gast's American Progress? It was actually a railroad poster that sought to assure Eastern Americans that it was safe to settle in the far West. It is an archetypal portrait of white settler supremacy. Notice how this movement from east to west, it's inexorable, it's unstoppable. Indigenous people are fleeing from it, as are wild animals, and all the modes of settler inhabitation, the covered wagons, the Pony Express, no less than 3 different locomotives. Remember, it's a train poster. The stagecoaches. Notice how it's the militia and the resource extractors leading the charge, followed by agriculturalists. And at the middle is this huge, whiter than white figure of Columbia, the mythic figure of Columbian conquest. She's stringing telegraph wire and holding in her hands, not a Bible, but a school book. This legacy haunts the landscapes of our watersheds, whether we are conscious of it or not. And yet we tend to live on top of our places, largely ignorant of and unconcerned about both how the water flows on one hand and how stories of trauma are layered in the strata of this land on the other hand. Biblical scholar David Carr, in his important book, Holy Resilience, argues that our biblical literature actually itself arose from a people's collective experiences of traumatic slavery, displacement, occupation, and violence. Carr defines historic trauma this way. It's an overwhelming, haunting experience of disaster, so explosive in its impact that it cannot be directly encountered and influences an individual and group's behavior and memory in indirect ways. Think of haunting. Reckoning with and healing these traumatic hauntings is therefore central to our biblical faith. For example, Jesus' ministry of healing focused on both internal and external oppression of marginalized persons by forces of domination. We see this in his exorcism of a silencing spirit in Luke 11 that renders its victim unable to speak or hear the truth, a powerful metaphor of our own disease of silence as settlers and silencing as the colonized. So we suggest in this book that Jesus' parable in Luke 11, arguably his strangest parable, speaks poignantly to the work of getting to the root of this disease that haunts our psyches, our communities, and the land itself. When the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it wanders through waterless regions. But not finding any resting place, it says, I will return to the house from which I came. And it goes and brings 7 other spirits more evil than itself, who enter and live there. Now, this is admittedly pretty strange stuff to our modern ears, but not for more traditional cultures. Jesus is inviting disciples to journey deep into the layers of our captivity and conformity in this archaeology of self and society. And he's warning us that the way to freedom for us will be much more difficult and protracted than we imagine.
In our work, we use the metaphor of peeling the proverbial onion, 7 layers down, with all the accompanying tears. The hauntings go that deep in our individual and collective spirits. Liberation is not about instantaneous deliverance, but about a lifelong journey of decolonization as healing. The Gospels portray the healer Jesus not as a socializing physician, that is, patching people up so they can carry on with the status quo, but rather as a radical doctor who seeks out the root of the disease. There is only one requirement. And here it is again. Jesus' call to join the movement to repent. To borrow from 12-step language, we must admit to ourselves and to each other that we are unhealthy, personally and politically. Recognize the lethality of our disease and turn to a power greater than our own. In this case, the gospel as strong medicine. And this means that we settlers have to recognize that the system of white supremacy and colonialism is also harming us. We long for our faith communities to be places where we white settlers can nurture the courage to peel the onion 7 layers down, to learn to feel the pain of our entanglement in racism and colonization in our home places, past and present, and to heal. The emotional labor of Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks having to share their pain so we can get it is just too costly. Our work cannot be sustained on other people's hurt, nor on their strength. A discipleship of decolonization is our onion to peel. We believe an important part of this work for European settlers is to critically trace our family lines from their immigrant journey to North America to the present, in order to understand how we are products of historical processes of violence and dispossession. And so in the book, we discuss tools for exploring our storylines of people, place, and spirit. We refer to these strands of communal narrative as landlines, past and present places of migration and inhabitation, bloodlines, family and community identities of race and ethnicity, and songlines, liberative traditions that inspire practices of justice and compassion. The heart of our book maps how readers can explore, interrogate, and decolonize these strands, using my Mennonite family as a primary example. I can attest. This is hard work, but it is also liberating. Its goal is to animate and empower personal and political practices of what we call restorative solidarity, which we first articulated in our 2009 Ambassadors of Reconciliation project, exploring how principles of restorative justice might be applied to historic and systemic injustices. We identify 3 core commitments for settlers. 1, to do our own work around issues like agnosia and dissociation, white fragility, ethnic loss, and assimilation, and the impact of intergenerational trauma and moral injury in order to understand our own deformation by and entanglement in the legacies and structures of settler colonialism. 2 is to listen to how Indigenous and other communities victimized by historic and current injustices are identifying harms, needs, and responsibilities, and investigating our own complicity. And to work with these resilient communities to make things as right as possible, including covenants of accountability, restitution, reparations, repatriation, and perhaps over time, even reconciliation. This process is an ongoing circle, a life work.
And ultimately, this work has to lead to concrete expressions of reparative justice. So here's a hopeful example from your own denomination. Stony Point, New York Presbyterian Church made the difficult decision to close its doors in fall 2017, which led to a real important gesture of repatriation. In 2016, the Presbyterian Church USA, as you all know, General Assembly, repudiated the doctrine of discovery, and the General Assembly called on all levels of the PCE USA to, quote, enter into dialogue, strategy, and action with Indigenous people of the region as part of a process of confession and repentance to redress wrongs. That's your denomination, not us. Our friends Rick Ufford Chase, formerly denominational moderator, proposed to Stony Point Pres that they explore with local Indigenous leaders a possible handover of their property. Discussions with Chief Dwayne Perry of the Wampanoag Lenape Nation culminated in a November 2019 handover of the former Stony Point Church and all its property to the newly created Sweetwater Cultural Center to promote the education, health, and welfare of Native peoples and to preserve their cultures and ceremonial practices. And today, that cultural center is up and running. It's a very exciting example of restorative repatriation. We conclude by returning to our own watersheds. Whether we are newer immigrants to Southern California or 5th generation settlers like myself, we live on the traditional and unceded lands of Indigenous people. In our case, the Chumash, in your case, the Tongva people, who are still among us, still struggling for justice, still landless and federally unrecognized bands. After all, in California, treaties made in the early 1850s were never ratified by the US government. And these communities are still demonstrating their cultural resilience and genius that has enabled their survivance.
Here again, is one practical suggestion. A good place to start is to recognize the history on top of which we live. So we would encourage Westwood Pres to practice, if you don't already, offering land acknowledgement in all your public gatherings, including worship. Such acknowledgements, of course, are only the beginning, not the end of our responsibility to place and to First Peoples. But they can animate an opening of our hearts and minds, institutions, and imaginations, which we will need for a discipleship journey into an ever more critically mindful engagement with our settler colonial legacy, and ever deeper relationships and collaboration with our Indigenous neighbors.